Hello, fellow Java developers. Welcome back to our starter course on Apache Camel. In this video, we will take a look at how to use Camel variables and exchange properties. We will see what's the difference between them, how to use global and route variables, and how to use VariableSend and VariableReceive. Let's begin. For this video, I've already created Camel project with all the routes that are necessary to demonstrate properties and variables. In this project, I have just Camel core and login dependency, main class that creates and runs Camel context, and all these routes at which we will look in a moment. Before we begin, let's refresh our memory on where properties and variables reside. As you can see here, both properties and variables are located within Camel Exchange. So what's the difference between them? Let's see how they work in routes. First, we will look at property. We can set property by using setProperty DSL element. Here we're specifying property name, and here we're specifying value, which can be constant or simple language or some other expression. Now, as property resides within an exchange, of course we can set and get properties through the exchange itself. For example, we can write exchange get property. Here we can specify its name and class. And in the same way, we can set property. So we can do this not only from the DSL itself, but of course from the exchange also. So this property travels our route along the exchange. We have one set of properties per exchange. In this example, we're setting this property and then we're using it to transform our body. Let's see how it works. And as you can see here, we've specified our property as myPropertyValue, and here is our transformed body, which uses this exchange property. If we're using exchange variable, there is not much of a difference. As you can see, almost the same route, but instead of set property, we're using set variable, and instead of transforming our body with property, we're transforming it with variable. Now, same as with properties, we can access our variables through the exchange. Here we can get variable and specify a class for it. And in the same way, we can set variable by specifying its name and providing an object. So the same as with property, but here we're using get variable and set variable methods, and the same with DSL element, we're using set variable and get variable DSL element, and of course in simple language we can reference both properties and variables. Let's see how it works. And as we can see, it's the same. We're using this myVariable variable to reference it in our simple expression, which forms the body of our message. So here are the main reasons to use variables instead of properties in most cases. First of all, properties have only exchange scope, but variables can have an exchange scope, as you've seen, a route scope, which means variable is tied to a route, global scope, which means variable is global for the whole Camel context. We'll see how to work with route and global variables shortly. Also, variables can be used with VariableSend and VariableReceive DSL element, which is very convenient. We'll also look at these features shortly. And finally, variables can have a custom scope, which means that you can use any custom implemented storage for variables you want. For example, you might store your variables in database and share them even between different Camel applications. And last but not least, some Camel properties are used internally by Camel. For example, if your property is called something like HTTP headers, you might have an unexpected behavior, as some Camel HTTP components might look into this property to configure their behavior. So, to sum things up, you should use variables instead of properties most of the time. They have different scopes, they can be stored in custom location like database and shared between different Camel applications. They have VariableSend and VariableReceive DSL support. And finally, variables are not used internally by Camel components, so you don't have a chance of overriding some important property by accident. Now, let's look at variables features. And first, we will look into variable scopes. Let's run our route, variable example route, and see what happens here. So, here we have actually two routes. One route starts at timed intervals, sets its own route scoped variable, and sends an exchange to the second route, which just logs the route variable itself. So let's look at route variable in more details. As you can see, to set route variable, we're using the same set variable DSL, but our variable name is prefixed with route and colon. That's how we're specifying that we're setting route scoped variable. Now, when we want to access route scoped variable, we need to specify again, same with set variable route and then colon. Then we need to specify route ID of the route which set our variable, then colon, and then variable name. This is the proper way of referencing route variable, and that's how variable is scoped to the route. To reference it, we need to know route ID, which set the variable, but we can reference this variable from other routes. And just to make sure, here we have a log of just variable reference, which will be null, because our variable here is route scoped, but not exchange scoped. So let's run this route and see what happens. As you can see, value of route variable is what we set here, my variable value, and value of exchange variable is null, because again this my variable is route scoped but not exchange scoped. This type of variables is used when you need to have some information about your route that other routes can also access. And with that, let's move on to global variables. Let's add global variable example route and see what's happening here. So, global variables have a scope of camel context, which means that to set this variable, we actually need to use camel context object. And as you can see, it has set variable method just for that. Let's copy variable name, it's my variable, and let's provide a value. It will be something like my variable value. So here's how we can set up global variables. They are context scoped, so they are set on the camel context. And to reference them, we're using variable.global and then variable name. Pretty simple. Let's see how it works. And while it runs, I will also tell you that in case of working with Spring Boot or Quarkus, you don't need to access camel context directly to set variables. You can use application.properties to set your global variables there. Let's see how it's done in the camel documentation. Here you can see that we can set camel.variable.variableName in our application properties, and then we can access this variable the same way with variable.global. In general, global variables are mostly used in the same way as application properties to define behavior of our routes through the properties resource. So that's it for global variables, and the next variable scope we'll look at is custom variable scope. Custom variable scope allows us to store our variables in location we've defined ourselves. For this to work, we need to implement VariableRepository interface, which has 4 main methods: getID, removeVariable, getVariable, setVariable, and also start-stop methods, which, in case we're storing our variables in some form of external storage, are meant to start and stop connections to that storage. So, let's look at our example VariableRepository implementation. For ID, we just have a string, and for our storage, we just have a hash map. Our remove, get, and set variable methods are just working with that hash map, but of course you can imagine that instead of this hash map we might have had some database storage or maybe Redis or something like that. And then for start and stop methods we do nothing because our hash map is initialized, and by the way it should not be static. So when you have some form of external storage, here in this start and stop methods you can establish and then clean up your connections. So we have this example variable repository, but how we're using it in our routes? Well, as you might have expected, we're using this ID to reference our custom scope. As you can see here, we're using example variable repository ID with colon and then variable name to set and then get our variable. The last thing that remains is to add our custom repository to camel context. As with any other bin, it's done with getRegistry.bind. As an ID, we're providing the same example variable repository ID, and as a bin itself, we're just providing new example variable repository. So let's see how this works. As you can also see in our example repository, we're logging each addition or deletion of our variables. So here we can see these logs. First, it's storing our variable with set variable when we're calling this set variable DSL, and then it's fetching this variable when we're accessing it through the simple language. And that's it for custom variable repositories. The next thing we'll take a look at are VariableSend and VariableReceive DSL elements. Imagine that your route is triggered by some request. Here we have our route started by timer and setting the body inside the route, but you can imagine this route being something like from GMS queue, and then you would have your GMS message as an initial message body. So imagine that you have this initial request, but then maybe to enrich or somehow transform your message or to provide additional data, you need to query some external service. For example, you might need to do some HTTP request. Here we're modeling this external service with this direct route. As you can see here, it just returns response from service and does nothing else. But you can imagine this to direct variable receive example service being something like to HTTP and then your maybe REST service HTTP URI, where you're getting some additional information. So let's run this route and see what happens. As you can see, our initial message body is lost when we do this, because when we're calling to DSL element and this producer endpoint returns a response, the response overrides our initial message body, So when we log it here, we have the response from our service, but we've lost our initial request body, which we might need for further transformations. The solution before introduction of variables would be to store our initial request body in some property, maybe like that, set property, let's call it request, and for the value we will take simple body, and now we can reference it here like that with simple language. It's exchange property dot property name, and let's see. And now, as you can see, we have both our initial request body and our response from service. But this is not the ideal solution, because we need to manually set property to save our message body each time we're making this two requests to external service. The better way of doing it is using toVariable or VariableReceive DSL element. As you can see here, as a first argument, we're passing the same endpoint URI which we've used for our to statement. For VariableSend, we don't pass anything because we're sending our initial request body, and as VariableReceive, we're specifying our variable name. We don't have to create this variable beforehand, it will be created for us by Camel itself. So when the response from this service returns, it will be written to this response from service variable automatically. Let's see how this happens. And as you can see, here we have our initial request body saved as our message body, and the response from our external service is written to a variable, which we access here. This is a very convenient way of querying the external services. And the last thing we will talk about today is VariableSend DSL element. Let's see. VariableSend example route. So, what do we have here? The problem is mostly the same as with VariableReceive example route. We want to query our external service, which in this case is modeled by this direct route. This external service returns some response, but we don't want this response to override our initial request body. We want to save our initial request as a message body in our exchange. But this time we also want to send some request payload to this external service. You can imagine something like post HTTP request when you need to send post HTTP request body. So if we don't have variables and we're sending to our external service, let's do that without variables. For demonstration purposes, we will see that our body is used as a request to this endpoint if it requires a request. As you can see here, our service logs that we have an initial request body as a request to the service itself. But if we want to use some other data that is not our initial request body as a request to this external service, without variables, we would need to again save our initial request body to some property, then override our message body with the request to the service, and then make a request. But with VariableSend DSL, it's much more convenient. You can just create a variable, then write your request to external service into that variable and use it in .toV DSL element as a VariableSend argument to make Camel use this variable value as a request to external service. Let's see how it works. And as you can see, our external service is receiving this variable value as a request value. And then we have our initial request body untouched as a message body, and a reply from the external service is written to VariableReceive, as we've seen already. So, to sum things up, VariableSend and VariableReceive provide very convenient way of querying external services with 2V DSL element without overriding an initial message body. So, let's quickly walk through what we've learned today. We have both exchange properties and exchange variables, which in the case of just set property, get property, set variable, get variable DSL elements are acting the same and are tied to our exchange that traverses a route. But variables are more modern and more preferred way of passing information along the exchange, because they have different scopes apart from the default exchange scope. In particular, route scope, which binds our variable to the route ID and allows us to access this variable from other camel routes by the ID. Then we have global variable scope, which is set at the camel context level. And we even have custom variable scope, where by implementing VariableRepository interface, we can define our own storage for variables, which allows us to even share variables between different camel applications. And last but not least, we have very convenient .2v DSL element, which allows us to use variable as a request to external service and automatically create a variable that will contain a response from that external service. So, in general, variables are the preferred way to move information along with our exchange through camel routes. And with that, here's the end of our video on Apache Camel properties and variables. Thanks for joining. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon. And if you have any comments or questions, leave them down below. I will answer to all of those. See you in the next video. Until then, happy coding!